Marstel-Day's campaign features thought leaders who are making contributions and spurring action on major wildlife conservation issues. And as a company, this is one of the ways that we can contribute to continuing to express our commitment to preserving wildlife and habitat. Seated here is James Fahn, a global thought leader who will be speaking about reporting on biodiversity and conservation. James is the Executive Director of Earth Journalism Network, a global community of over 5,000 reporters who cover environmental topics. James is a journalist who is primarily focused on environmental issues in developing countries. He spent the bulk of his professional career based in Thailand, where he was a reporter and editor of The Nation, an English-language daily newspaper. His book, A Land on Fire, recounts his experiences working in Southeast Asia. James has also written for the New York Times, Newsweek, The Economist, and the San Francisco Chronicle, to name a few. He is also an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, where he teaches a graduate-level course on international environmental reporting. Among his many distinctions, James received the United Nations Environment Program Global 500 Award for the nation's environment reporting and was pinned by Thailand's royalty in recognition of his service to the country. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Erica. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks very much to Marstel-Day and Rebecca for inviting me to speak with you. I'm looking forward to a pleasant hour of conversation. And I'm going to be talking today about, can we fire up the PowerPoint? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about what I do, which is media development in the service of covering the environment, and in this case, covering wildlife and biodiversity. So, as Erica mentioned, I head up a project called the Earth Journalism Network. We're actually part of a larger organization called Internews. Internews, if you're not familiar with it, is a global media development group, also nonprofit. And we support local press and media around the world on a wide variety of topics and subjects, including just helping them to, maybe it's building radio stations or covering health issues, or doing media policy, media law, media digital security even. But in my case, I head up Internews' environment department, which we call the Earth Journalism Network. And we're actually now a global community of over 5,000 journalists around the world who cover environmental topics. And you can see on this map, this is kind of a representative sample of where our members come from. This is by no means all of them, but just to show you, we're pretty much a global organization at this point. We've been in operation for almost 11 years. And it's really, we're slowly growing. We're actually just got a big new grant this year, so we've got more staff than ever before and more members, and it seems like it's a concept that's proven to work well. I should also mention that, especially in the beginning, we largely focus on developing countries. And this is because when you look around at the world, it's, the developing world, or the global south as it's sometimes called, has over 80% of the world's population. It's got most of the world's remaining biodiversity. It's got many of the world's fastest growing countries, and these countries are also emitting ever more pollutants. So I personally believe that much of our future, the future of our planet, will be decided in the developing world. That said, we are now a global organization. We also work in the US and in Europe and Japan. So increasingly, this distinction between developed and developing countries is becoming less meaningful over time. But it is true that many journalists in the developing world have less opportunities than journalists here in the States. So we think it's important to help them as best we can. We're not just a network of individuals, we're also a network of networks, if you like. We have many partner organizations around the world. Here you can see just some of them. We've helped to set up local networks of environmental journalists in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, and we've worked with existing networks in many other countries. And we have many different kinds of partner institutions, including universities, and NGOs and government agencies, wherever we feel can help us support our mission of improving the quantity and quality of environmental coverage. That's really our broad-based goal. Why do we do this? What is our theory of change? We believe that when people are supported with strong information ecosystems that allow them to access and exchange information, they're much more able to adapt, flourish, thrive, and help and respond to the many large-scale environmental changes we're seeing around the world. We actually have done a lot of research on this topic and have looked at how information affects public behavior, policy decisions. I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail. It's kind of tangential, I think, to our discussion today. But just to let you know, there is a whole school of thought about this and a lot of analysis that goes into determining how we can help move this conversation forward. But what about the environment? Why is the media important for environmental issues? Well, first of all, on the most basic level, of course, we can explain long-term environmental impacts and causes, and that's not often it's not very obvious. I mean, if you talk to probably most people around the world today, I mean, they may know the climate is changing, but they probably don't know why or what that means for them, and that's something that the media can really help explain. We also can reach diverse audiences to explain these things. I mean, it's certainly true that a lot of environmental groups do communications, and maybe Marstel-Day too also does communications, but often with the environmental groups, they're preaching to the choir, if you like. They're reaching their own audience, which is maybe already convinced of the need to focus on these issues, whereas the media, especially the mass media, can reach out to a much broader audience, even maybe to people who are quite skeptical about the importance of environmental issues. Of course, journalists also serve as a watchdog. We help to uncover kind of some of the corruption and other scandals that lead to environmental degradation. You might have heard of the kind of mantra for journalists is follow the money, right? Follow the money. That's how you find out what's really happening, who's behind things. Well, in the case of the environment, we follow the pollution, or follow the waste, or we look at who's benefiting from environmental degradation, because there's usually somebody there's a reason that there's pollution or poaching or whatever problem we're looking at, and who's benefiting from that and who's suffering from that. So it also becomes a justice issue as well. But if you look at that, and then you can analyze why these problems are happening and hopefully find a way to help solve them. And that's really one of our key goals, is to inform the public, inform policymakers, provide them better information so that we can have a better environment. But we face a lot of problems in the media, as you are no doubt aware. First and foremost, journalists often lack the time and the resources to cover these issues. It often takes a lot of time and money maybe to go out and travel into the countryside, really spend some time doing analysis, doing research on topics that are difficult to understand. It can be quite complex. A lot of scientific expertise is needed, and oftentimes journalists are not trained necessarily in science, or they are in science. Maybe it's in one field but not the other. I have a physics major, but that didn't really prepare me to understand all the chemistry that was involved when I was doing a story on mercury dumping in the Gulf of Thailand, and understanding how mercury interacts with seawater and fish and everything to pose a threat to the food chain. So it takes time, money, and takes expertise to do these stories. Also, the media tends to focus on the middle class, on the business sector, on the urban sector. Doesn't focus so much on the poor, on what's happening, especially in the rural countryside. And at least half the world's population still does live in the countryside, and that is where many of these issues take place. So the media often doesn't do a good job of covering that, And why is that? Does anyone want to speculate on why media does not do a good job of covering the poor or of focusing on that, or why it focuses on that?
That's who's reading the news.
Yes, and that's who's paying for it. That's who's paying for it, because that's where, excuse me, that's where the advertisers are, right? I mean, advertisers want to reach the middle class market, the business market, and so that's what's driving the news off. Also, the media is very good at covering crises, at breaking news, but not so good at covering incremental change, which is the kind of change that we see when it comes to biodiversity and climate change. It's not so good at covering solutions. So, for instance, it may cover, we do a good job of covering, say, Hurricane Katrina, what happens, but we don't do a good job at covering, say, you know, some of the climate change impacts that may have led to a fiercer storm, things like that. We do suffer from pressure and threats from vested interests. Unfortunately, journalists have been killed. In parts of the world, it's very dangerous to cover these issues. You can be kidnapped or murdered or just threatened, which is, you know, often enough to deter good coverage. There's sometimes resistance within the newsroom. Many editors are not so interested in the environment, or feel it's not a big deal, or or they think it's not as much interest to their audience. And on the other hand, there are some editors who are wonderful supporters of environmental coverage and real champions. So it really varies from place to place. We struggle with how to deal with certain issues like uncertainty, issues like climate change and biodiversity. We don't necessarily know what the impacts of a loss of biodiversity or a loss of wildlife are. Some of it is speculation. You're talking about the future here. But we need to try and figure that out and report that as best we can, while, you know, without losing scientific accuracy. Advocacy is always a tough issue as journalists. The kind of traditional approach, especially here in the West, is to try and maintain balance and neutrality and not become an advocate for certain issues. But journalists have different philosophies on that. I certainly hold to that traditional approach and believe it's important to kind of try and maintain a balance. But some journalists become very passionate advocates for issues, and they're very effective at that. And so at the Earth Journalism Network, we try and be a broad church and allow journalists, you know, so long as they're sincere in their mission of kind of reporting the truth, we try and allow all different kinds of views among reporters about that. And also, coverage tends to be pretty local and to focus on the negatives, so we do see a need also for more international coverage and more reporting on solutions. Now, what about biodiversity? And this is, especially at the Earth Journalism Network, we tend to speak more in terms of covering biodiversity as opposed to wildlife. To be honest, the stories about, quote, charismatic megafauna, you know that term, like big charismatic species, mainstream media does a pretty good job of covering that. I mean, you can turn on your TV at pretty much any time and see documentaries about fascinating wildlife, fascinating creatures and what they're doing. You know, that tends to be quite popular. But a story about the broader issue of declining biodiversity and what that means for our planet and for our society, that is far rarer and much harder to report on and to make kind of interesting. That really is the challenge, not just with biodiversity, but with many issues, which is to turn these kind of global issues, in this case, the loss of biodiversity, and make a local story out of it. Because that's what most audiences want. They want a story that, yes, is about interesting creatures and interesting people, but also how does it affect me? You know, what does that mean for me? And that can be very difficult. But we have different ways of trying to do that. One way certainly is to focus on people involved. Audiences always like to read or see stories about interesting people. And in the case of wildlife, there are some amazing scientists and conservationists doing incredible things in the service of research or conservation. And so focusing on them can be a really good way to get audiences interested in these topics. Also, interesting places. A lot of wildlife exists in some of the most beautiful places in the world, some of the most fascinating places. So you can do stories about parks or ecosystems, if you like. That can be a good way to enter a topic. You can do stories on the useful or unique characteristics of species. You know, like the hunt for cures for cancer in exotic species or not so exotic species, or you know, about the useful tools and inventions that we've gotten from nature, like sonar and radar and all manner of things these days are being created from wildlife. Another really interesting, kind of more recent topic that we've had success reporting on are trophic cascades. Does anyone know what trophic cascades are? Yeah. The most famous example, at least here in the U.S., is what's happened in Yellowstone when the wolves were reintroduced, right? Because, of course, we knew that was going to change the ecosystem, but it's kind of changed much more dramatically, I think, than most people realize. So one example is the wolves being reintroduced led the deer that were formerly, perhaps overpopulating the park from being thinned out and also being more careful. So the deer are no longer able to eat a lot of the vegetation along the riverbanks. So that led to a lot less erosion along the riverbanks and more tree cover along the riverbanks, which then led to more shade along the river and to different fish species returning that had previously not been lost out. So all these different cascades that are these impacts that we didn't realize that are affecting the ecosystem just by reintroducing this apex predator. Another really interesting example, and I hope I get this right, but one of the professors at UC Berkeley comes to speak at our class there. His name is Justin Brashears. He's done some really, you know him, yeah. He's done some really interesting work in West Africa. And he's shown how, and again, I hope I get this right, but so how foreign fishing fleets come to the coast of West Africa and they take a lot of the fish away, and that has led a lot of the local fishermen and local people to then seek their meat and protein from another source, and often they have to go after bush meat, which is wildlife, African wildlife, including many predators. The loss of those predators has led to an increase in the baboon population. The baboons have been invading the farms of local people, and that has led local villagers to require their kids to stay at home and keep the baboons away. So this one seemingly distant cause of these foreign fishing fleets taking more fish from the seas off Africa has led to school kids missing more education than they would have. I mean, that's the kind of trophic cascades that are very interesting to report on. And finally, we can report more on solutions. And there are a lot of solutions out there that people are trying that don't get a lot of attention. Obviously, the traditional approach is to create a protected area, create a park, create a wildlife conservation zone. And that works to a certain extent, but a lot of these conservation areas, unfortunately, become what's called paper parks, especially in many countries where there's not good governance. They're there on paper, they're there in the law, but they're not widely enforced. And you get a lot of poaching, you get a lot of encroachment, and sometimes the problems become worse because local people living around the park say, well, this is not our area anymore. We're not allowed to hunt there anymore, so let's go in and take whatever we can before we're totally excluded. So this conflict between local people and conservation, it's really important that we address this. And there have been all these creative approaches that are being tried. Buffer zones, for instance, creating zones in or around parks where you have different rules, or maybe allow some kind of foraging, but you protect certain species, or you allow some kind of farming perhaps, but it's not quite as intense. You don't have the kind of intense urban or road development that you might have strictly outside the park. Co-management is really important. That is, working with local communities to conserve areas or local species. And this often can be a win-win situation. One good example I like to cite in Thailand, when I was working there was a village in southern Thailand, it's a Muslim fishing village. And when I first arrived in the country in the early 90s, it was really destitute. You could get these big trawlers coming in the middle of the night, sweeping up everything. And the local people also have these push nets that we drag along the floor, ripping up, catching everything and ripping up the seagrass beds that serve as a habitat for the fish. And then they're cutting down the mangrove forests, another breeding ground for charcoal. There were no jobs for local youth, so they were going off to the city, and there wasn't a lot of fish left to catch. But then a local NGO came in and worked with the local mosques and the other local groups, and they agreed to kind of conserve the bay and stop this push net trawling. They would also form a little kind of a group of boats that would go out in the middle of the night, and when these trawlers came in, they would kind of ward them off, which is not easy because the trawlers are basically pirates and they become heavily armed. So you can imagine it's kind of scary to go out in the middle of the night and try and ward them off. But you know what? It worked. And within a few years, because the tropical coastal ecosystem is so fertile, the seagrass beds started coming back. The fish started to come back, so they had fish to catch. And even the dugong, which is kind of a local marine mammal like a manatee, came back, and that meant the media came, took lots of pictures of the cute little dugong, and then the tourists started to come. So, it's far from perfect, right? But, I mean, at least they could rebuild their livelihood through a little conservation. And that kind of model is becoming more widespread. It seems to work very well on a small scale. Larger scale is another issue. Another approach is ecotourism. This is, I think, pretty familiar probably with many of you. Is trying to save wildlife, use them as assets for the tourism trade, so that local people can make money, doing, hosting hotels or serving as guides and getting other business. So again, another approach that I tried to get a win-win. But if you're going to do ecotourism, you still need to put limits, and that's a really difficult thing to do. So you need to limit the number of people who can go there. Otherwise, there's always incentive to build more, and you start to encroach on the very thing you're trying to save. Certification is another really interesting approach, right? Things like fair trade, you've probably heard, like fair trade coffee. But there's now just about anything can be certified. Furniture, right? Can be anything. Any wood products can be built with materials that are certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. Fish stocks, fish harvesting is certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. Now there are all kinds of things can be certified. Tourism can be certified. Aquarium fish are certified. So that's another one, and that costs money. It does raise the price usually of the object you're purchasing, but it then helps the consumer be more confident that whatever they're buying has been harvested sustainably. Offsets, you probably heard of carbon offsets, right? Well, you can offset for wildlife too. There have been cases where I think developers in the American South, they wanted to build on some area where there's protected species, so they got a permit to do so, but in return they set aside some land as habitat for an endangered species of woodpecker. So offsets are another approach, but perhaps the most interesting and most promising approach is what's called payment for ecosystem services. Are you familiar with this concept? It's basically you're paying people to manage their surroundings in a way that is beneficial to the environment, or in this case for wildlife. And there are a lot of examples of that. One of the most famous examples is near where I grew up in New York. New York City gets its water supply from the Catskills and from the upper Delaware watershed. And it pays farmers lots of money to manage their especially their dairy farms in a way that doesn't pollute the water as much. And so that has helped New York City avoid building a very expensive water treatment plant they would otherwise have to build. So again, it's a kind of a low-cost way to try and help protect ecosystems and also support local businesses. So as for the Earth Journalism Network, how do we report on these things? We have 3 different approaches to cover. We have education, what we call network journalism, and geojournalism. I'm going to explain those in a little bit more detail, but one thing to point out is at the center of all of our work is producing stories on some of these topics that I just mentioned. Education, that's pretty straightforward. We do a lot of training. I am also, the reason I'm based here in Berkeley is because I teach a class at the Graduate School of Journalism. It's a lot of fun. We have great students there. In this case, we're also able to offer them travel grants. So during spring break, they go off and they do original reporting in different countries around the world. But we also do a lot of training in countries in China and Indonesia, and we're doing one later this summer in Chile on marine protected areas. So we'll tailor our training to specific regions and specific topics. Network journalism. We don't want to just be. We want to help support local networks of journalists form because they can be much more effective. They can work in local languages. They know the local issues, and they become our partners that way. So we give out grants. We give out fellowships. We do training of trainers so that they can do their own training, often much cheaper than we have to fly somewhere and do it. So networking is, and there are all kinds of possibilities now thanks to the internet to make this happen more easily. Just as an example, the kind of impacts, we have a climate change media partnership which we've supported journalists to go to the climate summit, and we'll be bringing about 30 or 40 journalists to the Paris summit later this year. And these are some of the impacts of that kind of work. You can see that a vast majority of them find that the experience has made them better journalists, certainly helped improve their climate coverage, and just made them better journalists overall. It's just a real boost to their career. I'd like to say we've tried to create a similar network for biodiversity journalists, and we've never really succeeded just because we don't get a lot of funding for biodiversity, and never really been sure why. We've tried. We're still trying, actually. We've got a proposal out now, so hopefully we'll get some in the future, but it's really been a kind of a mystery to me why groups that support biodiversity and wildlife conservation don't also support the media and better communications on it. So maybe that's something we can discuss. A third approach is is working with digital media and what we call geojournalism. This is a newish approach that we've been working on, and it seems to be very popular. We build these interactive maps that are focused on specific regions. So our first one was called Info Amazonia. You can kind of see a map of it, and a picture of it in the lower left there. It's a map of the Amazon region, covers all the 9 countries that are in the region, and we're able to visualize data. So there's all this data out there. I mean, there's a massive amount of data. You probably work with it a lot yourself at Marstel-Day. I mean, more than we can ever use, frankly. We were at the White House last year, and they were saying like their satellites collect something like 20 terabytes of data a day on climate Earth observation systems. They probably use only 10% of that. And the amount of that actually is turned into stories for the public is even a smaller percentage than that. So what we try and do is go out and collect that data and then find interesting ways to visualize it. And if you look up these sites like infoamazonia.org On the upper right is a site called Equatorial, which is, it's focused on Indonesia. And we create these interactive maps. On top of the maps, we visualize data, so you can have layers of data on different topics. In the Amazon, we have data on deforestation, on dams, on mining projects, on road projects, on social issues. Anyway, any data that you can visualize, and lots of different ways to do that, you can throw on this map, and so that people can see what is actually happening. And then on top of that, we put a layer of stories from our network of journalists in the region, and we geotag the stories. So you can zoom in to, you know, a section of the Amazon, see a story that provides narrative context of the data, and the data supports some scientific evidence for the story. Makes a nice combination, and it seems to be, again, pretty popular. So we're building new sites in Central Africa, in the Congo Basin, in the Mekong region, and in the Himalayan region. And there are other groups like Oxpeckers in South Africa. They built a geojournalism site that focuses on rhino horn poaching. So this could be the wave of the future. We think it is. And here are some of the reasons why we use this approach. Again, it's a way to use all this data that's out there and help people to understand the trends that are facing our planet. We've gotten some support from Google, especially Google Earth, and you can see Rebecca Moore, the founder of Google Earth Outreach. She's a big fan of this approach. Here's an example. You can see more clearly Info Amazonia. So we visualize the data on where deforestation is happening and when it has happened, the different years, so you can see trends over time. And then on the left, you see like a blurb for a story, which you can click on, and then get the full story if you're looking for that. And if you look on the map there at the top, you can see some of the maps available. There's one on oil and gas development. This one shows deforestation. There's one on showing the map of protected areas and indigenous lands, another on dams, so on. And a newest innovative approach is focused more on pollution, and this is to use, we're actually manufacturing and distributing sensors. These are small devices that can monitor air quality. So instead of relying on governments or academics to provide you with data, we can go out and collect it ourselves. And these sensors, we can manufacture and sell them for less than $100. And you can go out and figure out not just what the air quality is like in the Bay Area or in Oakland, which you might get from the government. You can find out what it's like in your kitchen when you're cooking up that, pork chop, or what it's like in your kid's school when those cars go by, or what it's like on your block. And those are things that unfortunately you won't get from other sources. And then in many countries around the world, you won't get any kind of data. Like Ulaanbaatar is Mongolia is one of the most polluted cities in the world. So we've got journalists in Mongolia who are trying to collect their own data and report on that and help raise awareness about these things. And it's not just air quality, we're also trying to build water quality sensors, and really there are all kinds of things that this revolution, what they call the Internet of Things, there's a lot of possibilities for really understanding our local environment in a much better way than we ever did before. Here's a picture of the Duino, as we call it, that we're manufacturing in China. So sort of in conclusion here, we are doing a bunch of biodiversity media projects. Most of our funding in this area is for oceans and fisheries. So we do a lot of training, as I mentioned, that workshop in South America that we're going to be doing on, that'll be on marine protected areas. We're doing projects in Indonesia and China. China is now the world's largest processor of seafood, so the way they manage their fisheries is going to be important for all of us. I think they've got fishing fleets now operating in over 90 countries around the world. So they are having a big impact, as you can imagine. We also we have a project to help raise awareness about illegal logging and forestry. But as I mentioned, there's been little grant funding for biodiversity in general. And I'm not sure why. I could speculate, but it's been kind of disappointing that we don't get more funding for that. So hopefully that will change. The interesting thing is one of our first and only projects on biodiversity took place 10 years ago was in Indochina, and it was one of our most successful projects ever. So our journalists, you see some of the impacts that we had. We took a bunch of journalists in Vietnam to a national park called Tam Dao National Park in the north of the country. It's one of the last areas with real natural forests in northern Vietnam. And there they discovered there's going to be a, quote, ecotourism project that was going to include a golf course and a casino. I guess it was going to be an eco-casino. But anyway, the journalists, they went back to their newspapers and wrote up stories, and immediately the central government stepped in and they ended up scrapping the project. They saved a national park. You can imagine if you're a young journalist in Vietnam, you don't have a lot of say in the way the country's run, but you do this one story and you save a national park. It's incredible. This project also uncovered a wildlife smuggling ring that was capturing was using false CITES papers from Laos to illegally capture wild macaque, a kind of monkey, in Cambodia, smuggle them into Vietnam, and then sell them to America and China for medical experiments. And these courageous journalists in Vietnam and Cambodia uncovered it. We have other cases in Indonesia where journalists helped stop, at least spurred a crackdown on illegal poaching of an endangered species called the anoa. They helped stop the development of a peat swamp, which, as you may know, stores a tremendous amount of carbon. So if those peat swamps get developed, they release huge amounts of greenhouse gases. So, you know, media development projects can have a big impact on conservation and wildlife. We've trained over 4,000 journalists now on a wide variety of topics, and they produce nearly 5,000 stories. And you know, we keep going on this, and hopefully, as I mentioned, we're going to doing more work on biodiversity in the near future. And that's all I have to say for now, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for that presentation, James. If we could open up questions, starting here in Oakland. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, I had one. I know one of the conversations in the media is how people are changing the way they consume it, print versus online. And I was wondering how that's affected reporting on environmental issues, if that's something that you have had to adapt to, or what you're doing.
Yeah, it's certainly all journalists have had to adapt to that, and we're seeing a lot more what we call convergence multimedia, where you have newspapers like, say, New York Times. They do a lot more video reporting on their website now, and you have CNN, which also has print reporting on their website. So you're seeing this convergence, and now all journalists, we often have to not just do a print story, but also provide some video along with some pictures and maybe some data graphics or whatever. So that's affecting everybody. But there are other ways. Of course, it's the whole digital media revolution. You're probably aware that it's really affected the business model for media, and it's really a lot of news companies and some major newspapers have had to go out of business, and it's harder than ever really to. Journalism is more popular than ever, but it's not. People don't want to pay for it necessarily. So there's more news and stories out there on the web than ever before, but getting people to pay for it is difficult, and so it's harder to be a journalist. And as media companies have downsized, news companies have downsized, often the first people they let go are the environment journalists and the science journalists. So it's been tough. It's been tough to be a beat reporter in that field, especially in the U.S. And I'd say in Europe. Now, other countries, the situation is not the same at all. India, the middle class is growing, and the newspaper circulation is growing. you know, so there's, you know, there's more journalism than ever, even in newspapers. Places like Indonesia, it's more of a mixed bag, maybe newspapers circulation declining, but TV journalism has boomed. So, so it definitely has affected environmental coverage, and that's one of the reasons why we believe this nonprofit model is really important. We're obviously not the only people doing this. There are some groups like, well, there are groups that, like ProPublica, that do follow a nonprofit model, do, say, investigative journalism. And there are some groups that pursue strictly environmental reporting through grant funding. But I think it's going to be more and more important to find diverse sources of income to support these topics.
Any other questions? Mira?
I was wondering, when you were speaking of that illegal smuggling of macaques, I was thinking, how much of a concern is safety when it comes to this kind of journalism, like when you're trying to reveal something of like illegal activities and such?
It's a huge concern, and we always have to be mindful of that. As I mentioned, there have been cases, even in recent years, of journalists being killed or kidnapped, otherwise threatened. There was a Cambodian journalist a couple of years ago who was covering illegal logging and was found murdered in the trunk of his car. There are Philippine journalists who covered illegal logging and have also been kidnapped and never seen again. And there are reports, I think groups like Reporters Without Borders has done reports on this issue. And it's something we always, you know, have to alert our members about. It's very difficult to know often what to do, whether to pursue a story that might endanger your lives. And we generally counsel our members, you know, don't be a hero. You know, if you think that their life may be threatened or some violence may ensue because of pursuing a story, step back. Better to, you know, let the story go and live for another day, because, you know, we obviously don't want to see anyone suffer. We do give training on safety tips, not just physical safety, but nowadays digital safety, right? Because it's easy to get hacked as well. There was a case I had myself when I was a journalist working in Thailand. I was covering a case of log smuggling. This group in Burma, which was kind of an ethnic rebel group that was fighting against the Burmese government back, this was 20 years ago. They were smuggling teak from Burma into Thailand. And as a result of the reporting, the Burmese government stepped in and basically attacked the logging activities, attacked the rebel group and shut it down. And on the last kind of day of operations, I and some other journalist colleagues drove to the border, to this refugee camp, which is kind of the center of operations. And there alongside the road were all these logging trucks just lined up trying to get a last bit of timber out of Burma into Thailand. And there was this big Mitsubishi Pajero, where the Godfather was there, and we knew that was him. And so I said, hey, we got to go interview him. You know, this is our chance to actually talk to the mastermind of all this illegal logging. And my friend said, no, you know, don't do it. You talk to him, you go, you know, quote, confront him, or even if it's just an interview, you won't be able to live another day without worrying someone's going to come up behind you with a bullet in it. Wow. And they were right, and I'm glad I didn't do that. And eventually, you know, his name did get out into the press, and there was a crackdown. So, you know, but that's the kind of thing where you have to make that kind of decision, and we, you know, we do tell journalists, you know, safety first. So it's an important issue.
James, let's take some questions from the other offices. Oceanside, any questions for James?
Hi there, this is Sarah. I had a question which I guess might be kind of the inverse of the question that Amanda asked. I was wondering if the Earth Journalism Network, as an organization that works in developing countries, if you're concerned about addressing the technology gap, particularly since a lot of the either urban or rural poor that are causing or experiencing these environmental concerns do not have daily access to the internet. So I was just wondering if there are any strategies going on for more creative means of news dissemination in this context.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, so a lot of these countries and regions, we tend to work more with other forms of media, like community radio is often a really good way to work. In many countries, people get their main source of news comes from radio, so we can work with radio stations to broadcast these. We'll work with whatever format seems to work best in a local region. But you're right that a lot of people don't have internet access mainly, or the way they're most likely to have access is through their phones. These days, people are kind of leapfrogging over the whole PC, internet medium, and they get their information directly from phones, through their mobile phones. Maybe they're smartphones or maybe not so smart, but for instance, in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, we've worked to set up text messaging networks. So we work with the local Dayak, our partners in Indonesia work with the Dayak in Borneo, where there's a lot of problems with encroachment by palm oil plantations, cutting down the natural forest. And so they set up this text messaging network where local farmers, if they see any encroachment, they can text it to everyone else in the network, including the local police and the local city and the university and the local TV station. And so an alert goes out that, hey, encroachment is happening in this place. And I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, it didn't stop all the encroachment, but it certainly did help, and it also helped the local people in their kind of negotiations with the big palm oil companies to get to try and halt some of this encroachment and protect their community lands. So yeah, we'll tailor whatever medium we have to. Yeah.
Any additional questions?
Thank you. That's all that we have here.
Okay, moving up to the upper left-hand corner there, James. Any questions from Fredericksburg?
It's kind of dark out there.
Yeah, we got the lights on.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. My question is, how do you approach either a news story or just the general public of a country that idolizes Western culture for just our progress, quote unquote progress, when actually their natural culture might be more sustainable than ours, but the general public wants to be more like the US with product availability, they want our clothes, things such as that. So how do you balance what the public wants versus what can be considered more sustainable?
Right. Well, dealing with consumption is a really tough issue, whether in the West or in developing countries, because it's hard to tell people what they can and they can't have. And if you try to tell them, chances are they'll want what they can't have. So, that is a tricky issue. Population that is also a really difficult issue. It's often a taboo topic that you're not supposed to talk about. But in a case like what you're describing, it's not necessarily us that will be doing these campaigns because we're not really an advocacy organization, but we'll often work with local groups that, their approach is to help local people take pride in what they have and to view that endangered species in the protected area nearby, which was under threat from poaching, which you need to protect it, for having them take pride. Say, this is something that you can protect that represents your local traditions and history, and it's something that is unique to your area. And so I think that whole approach of getting people to view their environment, their resources, their wildlife as a source of pride and not something to be consumed necessarily for, material gain, that's often a hallmark of all kinds of environmental campaigns. And I'll just give you another example that your question has raised to me, which is, what happens when you have a traditional culture that is actually damaging to the environment? And a good example is in China, where the tradition of eating shark fin soup has really had a big impact on, led to a lot of hunting of sharks and definning, and it's become a big problem, as you're probably aware. But there are groups out there that have done a really good job of working with local celebrities like Yao Ming and people to raise awareness about the problem of shark finning, and I think they made a difference. So this whole issue of culture and the environment is absolutely fascinating one. Sometimes culture, works to support the environment. Sometimes it works against it. But culture can be changed too, and we've seen that here in the U.S., where think something like whaling is no longer allowed here in the U.S. We don't, public won't support that. It is still a kind of culturally prized in countries like Japan and Norway and Iceland. Can that be changed? Should it be changed? That whole issue of culture and environment is a really fascinating one, and I think always worth reporting on.
A similar
So
question.
as a, oops, no.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Jesse.
Okay, just as a follow-up for that, I actually have an Icelandic friend, and she says that it's not in Icelandic culture like their ancient culture in whaling.
Interesting.
But Iceland tries to portray it as their culture, to say this is our culture, that's why we do it. But she's researched their ancient culture and says, no, it's not. So how do you really, I don't want to say fight that, but how do you try to show them, no, this isn't your culture and it is also hurting the environment,
Well,
et
that
cetera.
sounds like a great story. Maybe your friend should write up a story, publish it in Iceland, and we'll help them do it if you can. So that's how you do it, right? I mean, you just got to get the word out there, and get out there in the public debate. I think that's the whole battle.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So James, I have a question. A lot of our work has revolved around compatible land use planning and habitat conservation. And those, of course, are important environmental issues and biodiversity issues. But we're also now beginning to try to help do some, I think, leading edge work on sentinel seascapes. That is to say, what in the maritime and the littoral is critical for conservation, for all of the factors: ecosystem services, climate change, public health and safety, fisheries, and all of it. Since so much of your work is focused on the ocean at this point, and you're also working on the land, what can you tell us from your ocean work that might be helpful to our folks as they move from the terrestrial focus, sometimes to the maritime and the littoral, in terms of coalition building and communication strategies to deal with stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lee. As you say, there is been this whole push in the last 5-10 years to try and move the conservation movement and approaches like protected areas from the land to the sea. And I think a lot of that is still very new to many countries around the world. So, for instance, that's why we're doing this workshop in Chile later this year, is to try and help introduce to the media as well as to audiences this concept of marine protected areas, why they're important, and how they can be useful not just to protect species, but protect livelihoods and sustain fish stocks, because scientists have shown that if you can create a marine protected area, the fish that thrive within that area, if it can be enforced, will eventually they'll overpopulate and they'll swim outside of the area, and they'll create fish that can be harvested for local jobs and livelihoods. So, first of all, just remember that this concept of marine protected areas and marine zoning, it's kind of new to a lot of places. But I think it's going to be really important to, figuring out how we manage our coasts and even the deep ocean, because, we just did a workshop at the panel session, the World Conference of Science Journalists, and it's, things are getting worse in the oceans. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind for most people. And fish stocks continue to be depleted and harvested unsustainably. And it's, we need all the solutions we can get. So, what lessons can we learn from that? I think there are good examples where effectively you've had zoning. It might not be called that, like that example of that Thai fishing village I mentioned. Effectively, they created zones where certain kinds of fishing were not allowed. And so finding out, maybe doing some research on where that's happening, where it's been successful, and why it's been successful, because building those coalitions to do that, that's really the hard part. Getting the trust. Getting that trust is the hardest part. And you got to work with local institutions. You got to make those local institutions understand. You got to get buy-in from everybody, because if there are free riders, then the system falls apart. So that is really the hardest part, is building that trust.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Anything else in subject for folks? Guess we're out here, Erica.
Thank you, Lee. If we could turn to the Alexandria office for any questions.
Yeah, hi, Brad Adams here. Just a question for you. As you're talking about reaching out to some of these individuals in some of the poor communities, for example, that are hunting bushmeat because they need the protein. I heard you talk about trying to influence the individuals, but what about influencing the leadership, the people that have impact over those individuals, whether it might be a state village or a mayor? What can you address on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's always the hardest part, is especially if those leaders have vested interests in sustaining that trade. Often when you do media development, the hope and the theory is that if you can build enough public support for or against some kind of environmental topic, whether it's like against bushmeat hunting or for protecting a local ecosystem, that will filter up, and eventually the leaders will be forced to pay attention to these topics. In some cases, you do have enlightened leaders, and it's kind of the other way around, and you can find local leaders who are willing to support these issues, and then it's a matter of convincing the people that this is an important topic. So you never know. The dynamic is often it changes from place to place, but especially in countries where you have some democracy, even if it's a flawed democracy, building support through the media, it's often one of the few kind of advocacy tools that you have out there, because in many of these countries, they don't have the functioning legal system that we might have in the U.S. So they might have laws against some of these activities, but they're not enforced at all. And one way to get it enforced is to basically name them and shame them, right? So if you can show it's happening in the media, you can show who's behind it, that will often turn the tide. Not always, but sometimes. So it is one of the few tools that are out there in many developing countries to make a difference.
Any other questions?
Thank you. That's all we have from Alexandria.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Can we turn to the phones? Is anyone on the line that has a question for James? Okay, you might need to unmute yourself. All right, James, I don't hear any other questions. I'd like to ask everyone to thank James for providing us with some really great insights into what's happening on a global scale. James, I would ask you if you could leave us with any thoughts as to, how we can get more involved. These are certainly issues that are really important to us. Is there anything on the local level, or we are doing more work internationally? Where can we continue to seek to make a difference?
Support your local newspaper, support your local press, maybe a magazine about environment or nature, ABC, sometimes you're out there and you're like saying, well, do I really want to pay for this story, or do I want to, support, and it's always tempting to avoid that, but, the press, the media is something that is vital to our democracy and certainly vital to our environment, and you can see in those countries where there's not a free press that often their environment is one of the things that really suffers for it, and we see that time and time again. So, consider supporting that local environmental journalist, whether it's through a newspaper or a magazine or subscription or a Kickstarter campaign or something. We need to find ways to fund and support the journalists who are often covering these issues under very difficult circumstances. So I hope all the help you provide would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again to James for sharing his experiences on reporting on biodiversity and conservation, as well as the great work that the Earth Journalism Network is doing. This was the 6th talk in our Wildlife Conservation Awareness campaign, and we're pleased to share that we're taking another step to support wildlife and conservation by making a contribution to Internews. The Earth Journalism Network is a project of Internews, and we're happy to support their work. Until the next Wildlife Awareness campaign, you can follow Marstel-Day on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn.